Hello, welcome to another edition of the Brungart Law Podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to explore what makes for effective practices, policies, and laws, which ultimately enable effective decision-making and leadership, the interplay among all of the above. And today's guest, we have here former Ambassador Nancy Jo Powell. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Well, it's definitely a treat and a privilege for me hosting you, someone who's not only been an ambassador, but an ambassador to India, a country with a major population, but also an ambassador 5 times, having served in Uganda, Ghana, Nepal, Pakistan, and then India. Tell us a little bit how all this started, going from being a social studies high school teacher in Iowa to being an ambassador of India.
It was quite a journey and a very rewarding one for me. I did not anticipate that when I joined the Foreign Service, but I came from a town of 900 called Dayton, Iowa, not Dayton, Ohio.
Oh,
quite
sorry.
a difference.
Sorry.
No, you got it right. And was teaching social studies, made a trip to Pakistan as part of a government program to improve the teaching about the Third World during the summer of 1975, so 50 years ago, and was then acquainted with the Foreign Service for the first time, and took the exam and was lucky enough to pass both the written and the oral exam. And I joined in January of 1977.
And that must have been an interesting experience, because from what I understand, when you initially joined the Foreign Service, it was approximately a class of about 40 individuals, but there were only 5 women, and out of those women, only 2 of you remained.
That's right, but it was also an interesting time just in general. It was 2 weeks before the transition from President Ford to President Carter. It was the post-Vietnam era where the State Department was adjusting to not having the huge mission in Vietnam. And also there had been a major class action suit filed by women in the Foreign Service at that time, which found a number of areas where there was practices that were against the law. And so it was starting to have some cracks in the glass ceiling. The Foreign Service had been traditionally in the 1950s, 1950s, what was on the shorthand called Pale Male Yale. And certainly a female social studies teacher from Iowa didn't quite fit that mold. But there were 3 others. There were 3 of us from the Midwest. Everybody else was from one of the coasts. So it was quite a challenge to meet these people and to feel like I was going to be part of a group with them.
But did you feel initially welcomed by your male cohorts that were in your candidate class overall?
Overall, they were. And I will tell you, the very first meeting that we had, we were welcomed by a senior official from the State Department who told an incredibly sexist joke.
Okay.
And the 5 ladies during the break retreated, as you're wont to do, to the restroom, the ladies' room, and said, "What in the world was that all about? We didn't encounter that in our teaching, in our universities." That was sort of the welcome to the State Department. And there were certainly examples of sexism, but I found overall I benefited and from the changes that were being made, and the people. I was lucky enough to work with people who were making the changes.
Speaking as a woman, and from your initial career assignments and then throughout the progression of your career, did you find, whether you were correct in your observations or not, but did you find or believe you had to work harder than your male counterparts?
I had gone to New York City for a program while I was teaching, and one of the things I bought was a poster that said something about women have to work twice as hard, twice as long as their male colleagues. And then there was an asterisk on it. And when you looked below, it said, actually, that's not very hard. And I had kept that poster. There was another one that I bought at the same time that said, a woman's place is in the house, another asterisk, and it said, and in the Senate.
Did you ever hang up that poster in any of your offices?
No, it was at home, though. I saw it at home.
Interesting. Well, tell us a little bit about your initial training in the Foreign Service, did you find that at that time it adequately prepared you for your career?
I don't think it was an introduction to the State Department, to its roles, its organization. It's a very hierarchical organization, so that learning that piece of it. It was, as I say, during the 5 weeks that this training existed, we went through the transition from Secretary Kissinger to Secretary Vance. It was obvious that things were going to change, that while we were learning the basic structures and the basic functions, it was a time of change for the State Department, for America in general. That was followed by language training. I was going to Ottawa. I joined the Foreign Service and went all the way to Ottawa, which actually turned out to be a very good assignment for me. I got over the culture shock of being in the State Department, and then went off to Nepal, where I had could have had real culture shock. But the language, I studied French, and then we had 5 weeks of what I thought was some of the best training I had in the Foreign Service to help people get ready to be visa officers. Almost all of the junior people still today will do at least one tour as a consular officer, where you're handling the visa services, services to American citizens. And so it was really excellent hands-on training with people that knew what had been through it, knew what they were doing, and transferred those skills. So when I got to the consular section in Ottawa, which was a fairly easy one to work in, I knew what I was doing with that. There may have been other parts of the State Department that the 5 weeks didn't prepare me for, but the consular training really was among the best that I had in my entire career.
For the benefits of our audience, give them, although it's been some time, but give them some insight as to what it's like to be on that visa line, interacting with with the local population, and knowing that you have only a few minutes to really make a decision.
The interesting and unique thing about Ottawa is that you don't deal with the local population, because they don't need visas to come to America. So at that time, Canada had a rule that any Commonwealth citizen could come to Canada without a visa. So there were a lot of Commonwealth countries, particularly where perhaps the visa application process was lengthy, there were long lines. They would come to Canada and see if they could get a visa in Canada. Didn't always work out, and I had to learn a lot about what was going on in Nigeria, what was going on in Haiti. Was this a good case? Was this not a good case? I spent a lot of time on American citizen services. There are American citizens that live, obviously American citizens that travel to Canada. They get into all kinds of trouble. They get arrested, they die, they get in the hospital, and so Canada was a fairly easy place to do that compared to Nepal, where I did the same work. The infrastructure in Canada, obviously, and I was only 60 miles from the border, so getting them home was not a big deal. But during the time I was in Canada, the movie Midnight Express came out, and this was the story of a consular officer who failed to provide the adequate services to a person arrested, I believe, in Turkey. Yeah. And it prompted an outcry from Congress that all American citizens in jail had to be visited once a month by a consular officer. My clientele was very different from that in Turkey. I had primarily people that were felons. They were there for murder, they were there for breaking and entering, but I had to go once a month down to, it was on the St. Lawrence River. They had 5 prisons, and male prisons, and 1 women's prison. And then I had 1 in Quebec that I went to. But this was an introduction, and I was, for the most part, the only visitor they had. It was hard for their family to get to them, so there was an appreciation. We also created a program that allowed them to transfer to an American prison, and there was a real push to get this done, and my prisoners looked at me and said, "Are you kidding me? We'll stay in Canada, thank you."
Well, speaking of that experience as a consular officer, when you were ambassador in the different missions, share with us how you would rely on the consular section to inform some of your decision making, considering they basically have their finger on the pulse due to their constant interactions with local populations?
A couple things. Part of it is just the management, depending particularly in South Asia, the crowds were fairly large, and we developed appointment systems and at people that didn't have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning or pay somebody to stand in line for them, which was one of the practices in India, both India and Pakistan. It was also one of the things you learn in ambassador school is that the ambassador does not have the right to tell a consular officer what decision to make. They can make a recommendation that this is a senior official, this is someone that is known to me, but that's the end of it. You can ask for a review of a decision, but you cannot interfere in the decision. And sometimes that's hard for ambassadors to learn because there are so many other things you can control, but that's one of them that you cannot. The decisions are, you learn techniques and you watch your colleagues, and one of my colleagues had a technique of asking for car keys, and it turned out in Pakistan that they were renting car keys down the line so that everybody had a set of car keys, even though it was the same set of car keys. So you have to be careful about not getting into too big a pattern. But particularly, you could see, where students were going, the desire to go to America. I think the student population, the foreign student population, is one of our silent weapons.
Could you expand upon that?
Sure. They come to America. They live here for 4 years. They're with Americans constantly in their classroom, in their dorm or apartment, wherever they live. They are influenced by their professors. They learn a certain method of thinking about the world that I would call a more American way, a pragmatic way. And that for the most part, obviously there are people who have a sour experience for one reason or another. But if they stay in the United States, they brought us talent, and they're incredible, particularly in the IT field from South Asia. We have benefited enormously. But if they go home with a positive attitude toward America. They can deal with some of the misperceptions and say, no, it's not like that. That's not what the people that invited me for Christmas were like. The other thing that I found, particularly for India and Pakistan, that the Indians and Pakistani students would get together. They were looking for the aunt who had the best cooking. And they would go on Sunday night to have supper. And they continued to have some of those. It was difficult in the early years. Now with the social media, they can do it. They can keep in touch. They go to each other's weddings. They follow each other's careers. And they're dealing, no, that wasn't like how the Indian that I met in my university class was. That's not how the Pakistani was. There's no dollar value for that, but it is an enormous benefit, I think, to the United States. When I was in Pakistan, we'd had a program for about 20 years where we sent mid-level Pakistani bureaucrats to get a master's in public administration. As I sat with senior officials in Pakistan trying to design a new aid program and other things, I could tell who had been in the American universities just in the way they thought and were making the plans. And so it's a huge benefit to us. And I'm very sorry to see what's happening right now.
What would be some of those characteristics that would immediately stand out to you that you'd recognize this person obviously at some point studied in the States?
It was a can-do attitude of we can do this, let's get it organized, of a plan rather than just having ideas out in the atmosphere and trying. But the planning, the organization, and have we got a goal here? Is this the right goal? And much more goal-oriented than might be normal with the regular civil service.
So, from your opinion, there are much greater benefits to having, for lack of a better expression, a liberal immigration policy accepting students from overseas than there are the potential risk associated with those.
Obviously, you have to take a look at there are occasional scams where somebody creates a university and it's just an employment agency, and ICE and others are pretty good about finding those. You take a look if they've not succeeded in their own pre-university education, it's like, well, how are they going to make it in America in a new language? But by and large, you're getting very, very talented students, and it's a huge opportunity for them. There are better schools now, particularly in India, that are along the American model. And in fact, they have one of them that I visited was connected to Wharton, another one to other schools. And so, they're looking at trying to strengthen their senior university education as well. But, you would look and see whether someone else in the family had overstayed.
Yes, the validation studies.
The validation studies. We didn't have social media when I was doing it, so we didn't have to worry about looking at their social media. But these are students who are coming at a time when there are lots of issues to protest about. I have no problem with that as long as they're not violent. Other people do. But
okay. Returning back with a focus on sort of the Foreign Service and preparation and training, and through your career progression, where have you seen the improvements in how the Foreign Service prepares its personnel at the entry level and mid-level?
I think starting with the big one was the Foreign Service Act of 1980, which made huge changes in particularly the system for promotion within the Foreign Service. It became similar to the military, where you have an up-and-out system. The colonel to brigadier level, you lose a lot of people at that level in the military. It's the 01 to the senior Foreign Service, but it's the equivalent of a colonel to a brigadier. That was a huge change. You'd had a bit of stagnation at the top until people reached retirement age, even though if they were not really progressing in their own leadership skills, their own assignments. And so that was a major change. The recruitment of women, I would say even geographically, there are a lot more people from other parts of the United States now, the more of the University of Northern Iowa and probably less of the Harvard and Yale, Princeton, Stanford. You had the glass ceilings being broken by women as they entered into being deputy chiefs of mission, the number 2 at an embassy, more women ambassadors. It took a long time, but eventually there was an assistant secretary that was a woman in the regional bureau for the European Bureau was the first one. Those were all firsts while I was in the Foreign Service. It seemed strange, but it took a long time to have that happen. The training, the big change in the training was under Secretary Powell, who had come out of the military, obviously, and was used to a very rigorous and a very well-developed training program that developed not only the military skills, but the leadership skills for the people that were going to be general officers. And he was just aghast when he came and didn't find a counterpart to that at the State Department. There was training if you were going to be a deputy chief of mission. There was training if you were going to be an ambassador. But there was nothing for those people that were going to head up an office or a small consulate. And so he worked very seriously with the Foreign Service Institute, which is the school that's part of the State Department, to develop a leadership training program. And every officer that crosses what we call the senior threshold from being the colonel to the brigadier, but whether Foreign Service or civil service, because they're both in the State Department, has to take this course. There have been additions to it. There are all kinds of things about managing the budget, managing the social media, managing people. But the key one was the leadership skills, and that dates from Secretary Powell in 2001.
What are some things that you find really haven't changed over the years that make for effective decision making and leadership?
I'm not sure that I fully endorse it. Making better decisions, but the State Department remains very hierarchical compared to Google or to the IT field in particular. It's a bit of a transition for young people coming into the Foreign Service now to realize that there's still this hierarchy.
Yes.
And so but it also, when you're in a crisis, means that when the ambassador says move, people move. And you might have a discussion, a debate about which options are best, but once the decision is made, that's the ambassador's decision, and it goes forward. And I think given the state of the security challenges in embassies, that's important, and it works out primarily in that. I noticed yesterday I was listening to CNN on my way into Washington, and the embassy in Bahrain, where the Fifth Fleet is,
Yes.
was under duck and cover.
Yes.
So they clearly had an emergency action committee meeting, and they made decisions about they didn't have time to go home. They would have to stay in place and do shelter in place and do the best they could. It turned out not to be an attack on Bahrain, but they must have had some information. Yeah.
Speaking of the organizational hierarchical structure of the State Department, within the State Department, also outside, many state that it doesn't have effective leadership because it operates through consensus. Comment on that, please.
I would say a couple things about it. Number one is it's one of the changes in that people have become more willing to have a discussion. What are the options? What are the pluses and minuses of these options? Excuse me.
Sure.
And it used to be the ambassador maybe would consult with 2 or 3 people, make a decision, and that was the end of it. Whether it was something to do with the lunchroom or something to do with foreign policy, that was sort of the way it went. It's changed. Obviously, there's more interaction, more willingness to take other ideas, and I think that's a good change. One of the things that happened with the State Department, particularly in the exam process, has changed for onboarding people, with much more emphasis on interpersonal skills that then develop into leadership skills. When I joined, the focus was on your intellectual skills. How smart were you? How articulate were you in defending a position? What area expertise did you have? What language expertise did you have? And then without any training, you expected people who had perhaps just an encyclopedic knowledge of a particular area in a particular language to all of a sudden become the leader of an embassy and manage a community. And it didn't, frankly, work all. Sometimes it worked. You learned by example. You watched a good ambassador, which is what I did. You watched perhaps some that were not quite so good, and you said, I'm not going to do that if I ever get a chance to be an ambassador. But that, it wasn't a formal structure.
Yes.
And so the much more emphasis probably about 5 or 6 years after I joined, they started doing group exercises as part of the oral exam. How do people relate? If they have their elbows out, are they consensus builders? Are they team builders? And that became a part of the Foreign Service exam. The promotion system looked at people, if they were leading a section, how well did they lead it? Did they take care of their people? Did they mentor them? Was it organized in a reasonable way? And so the leadership skills became more important as part of promotion. And when you were put up to be a deputy chief of mission, a consul general, or an ambassador, that was the skill that was looked at. It was very nice if you spoke the language and very nice if you had some knowledge of it, but it was more, can you run the embassy?
Did you find, let me rephrase this. What did you change over time in your leadership style, in your decision-making practices through your 5 ambassadorial positions?
One of the things to keep in mind is that my 5 embassies were quite different. Uganda was and Nepal, Uganda were relatively small. Ghana was a medium-sized one. Pakistan, we were unaccompanied in Pakistan, so it was 100 some people, 125 people, but everybody working. You didn't have a community for that one. The embassy and consulates in India are among the top 5 in terms of size around the world. So you had different challenges in each one of those. I think by and large, particularly Pakistan was probably the most challenging because we were on 1-year tours. Most people were on 1-year tours. I don't think that I ever had the same people on my senior staff meeting from one week to the other. Somebody was on vacation, somebody was on R&R, and There was a new person that had just come in. It was a constant churn, and that makes it more difficult to do some of the. You don't have the same feeling if you've worked with somebody for 2 years and they give you an idea and you're used to getting really good ideas. You say, "Ooh, this one I need to think about." But you had to make those decisions quickly. This person knows what they're talking about, or they're over here crazy inland. So it depended. In India, you had the 4 consulates, and so working with them, one of them was bigger than my embassy in Nepal had been, and did not have the infrastructure, the personnel infrastructure to run that big a mission. They were still thinking it was some kind of a little consulate. And it's like, wait a minute, I had all this help in Nepal with administrative and other things. We got to replicate that, to have the support that they needed in Mumbai. So the challenges that way. I would say one of the other things we were talking about, what had changed, is what I call the CNN effect.
Okay.
When I first went to Nepal, there were no international phones system, so we did everything by cable. Communication with home was by letter that took 2 weeks to get there via the diplomatic pouch. Now, not only do the people inside the countries, in very large percentages in South Asia at least, have cell phones, but the operations center at the State Department has a direct link to CNN International. And when I was in India the first time in the 90s, we were being scooped by the operations center. They'd call and say, what's going on in this town in India? And we're like, we don't know, because we didn't have televisions in the embassy. And so CNN has brought the world much closer. Obviously, there are more than CNN. The social media exchanges now. But so that's a big change. And managing that has its challenges, too.
Well, information today obviously is much more readily accessible and available. And there's a plethora of it.
And some of it's good and some of it's not.
Exactly. Speaking to that, do you find that perhaps earlier in your career, government personnel were perhaps more self-reliant and independent thinkers compared to today, when there's still that desire to have that one extra bit of information?
I think there's that. There's also a much more, when I was in Nepal and we were depending on cables, something happened in Nepal, we made a decision at that level and we sort of took care of it. Now, if Washington has seen it on CNN, they want to play and perhaps make the decision, and not necessarily based on what the embassy is seeing. It's much more of a tug of war as a result of maybe CNN is only reporting that there are demonstrations, and then you say, but it's like Los Angeles last week. It was a very, very small piece, but what you saw on TV made it look like the whole city was on fire. Well, if you're looking in the op center, maybe it's time to evacuate, and you're the ambassador going, wait a minute. So Washington is much more involved, I think, in the decision making than, and even compared to the 17 and 1800s, where you had to rely on a boat to take your information back. So probably much more of a Washington and much more of an NSA or NSC involvement in it, the White House being involved in it more than they used to be. And that's been was a trend over my career.
Do you find that perhaps sometimes overseas in some of our diplomatic missions, we may have a tendency to sort of normalize deviance, and then that ends up leaving folks sort of blind to what would normally be a red flag?
It can happen. We call it, George Shultz, when he was secretary, had a big globe in his office, and he would receive each ambassador that was going out to represent the United States, and he would say to them, so which country do you represent? And about 9 out of 10, until the rumor went around the building, would point to the country they were going to. And Secretary Shultz would sort of say, no, that's actually not. Let me show you. And he'd point to the United States. And so there's also you can get used to things that in America would seem very, very strange. There's a certain amount of I can work with this person, and perhaps the person is an autocrat, perhaps the person is doing human rights violations, and you have to be able to separate and say these are the things that are happening, but at the same time we can get X, Y, and Z done in this country, and making that balance work. The annual reporting on human rights, on trafficking, those kinds of things help to document that and help keep the embassy, making sure that they're not just whitewashing everything.
Going back to earlier, which was an example of a law that sort of enables for leadership, the Foreign Service Act of 1980, you mentioned how that had an impact. It sort of opened doors, enabled women to more effectively break through the glass ceiling. If you wouldn't mind sharing briefly, now, how do you end up communicating diversity where people are confident that folks aren't being tapped for positions or hired simply because they meet a certain gender or racial or ethnic profile? How do we get past that?
I think there's a couple ways, and when I was the Director General, which is the equivalent of head of personnel, we were trying to work on that, obviously trying to make the Foreign Service look more like America. There were programs that were helping young people, particularly from lower economic strata or minority groups, by getting them the education they needed to pass the test. I had the experience of sitting in being part of the senior staff meeting when Secretary Powell first came on, and he would, if the meeting had gone quickly, he would try to use the meeting to get a sense of the building of the culture of the State Department, vice what he was used to at the Pentagon and in the military. And one morning he said, people are telling me it takes way too long to get people into the Foreign Service. We're losing good candidates. Why don't we just do resumes? And there was sort of the room sort of split in half, with some people almost applauding and saying, it's the 21st century, this is the way to go. And one man looked at me, looked at a couple other people, and he said, "Sir, with all due respect, there are a number of people in this room who wouldn't be here if you did that." We got here because we passed the exam, but I couldn't be an unpaid intern when I was in college. I had to work. I had to help pay my tuition. And Secretary Powell nodded his head and said, "Got it." But the exam is taking more interest in languages. It's not just the exam now. There are other factors that are considered. It's a concern to me that we not go back to pale male Yale by using that system. But we all came in knowing we had passed the exam. And I think that was a benefit for those of us that came from perhaps lower income brackets, and the University of Northern Iowa is not exactly on the list of the top 10 universities, although I got a very good education there. So, helping people prepare to take the test, to get into the Foreign Service, to have the experience. There's mentoring of those students by Foreign Service officers or retired Foreign Service officers. They're named after Representative Rangel and Ambassador Pickering, so they're Rangel-Pickering Fellows. There are efforts within the State Department, various groups. Ambassador Ruth Davis just passed away, but she had founded one for black members of the Foreign Service, and worked very hard to promote, to know what the issues were, to see if they could be addressed through leadership practices, whether the laws needed to be changes, the foreign affairs regulations needed to be changes. So that has been a part of it. They also formalized the mentoring. I was lucky enough to, particularly my second tour, which in Nepal, to have a wonderful deputy chief of mission who mentored me and became a mentor for my entire career. Similarly, in Pakistan, the deputy chief of mission, I wasn't a junior officer, but I was getting ready to be a DCM, a deputy chief of mission, and she helped me a lot with that. It has now been formalized for the deputy chief of mission to have the mentoring responsibility. and to see, in a big embassy like Delhi, to make sure that other people are doing it. He or she could not do it all. But that has helped. They are evaluated as part of their personal performance evaluation as to whether they have carried out their mentoring responsibilities or not. And I worked for an Ambassador Rafel, for whom an award has been made for mentoring every year of the person selected by, and usually nominated by their officers that they have mentored. And so the mentoring is incredibly important. And then in the selection process, people can bid on being a deputy chief of mission. They can bid on being an ambassador. The regional bureaus will then put together lists. The personnel system will vet those people. Do they have outstanding civil rights challenges? Do they have anything in their background, ethics issues, or that kind of thing that might be a question mark, as that maybe they got over it. They had a problem as a junior officer. They've moved on. But to give that, and then there is a committee chaired by the Deputy Secretary of State and made up of the undersecretaries, the Director General, that makes the nominations to the White House for the career people. I would tell you that there are no nominations pending right now for career people. All of the ambassadors that have been appointed in this administration are political appointees. There are career people serving overseas now, but I think that system is probably on hold.
Speaking to the mentor that you had early on in your career, what exactly has remained with you from this mentor? What did this mentor do that you felt, and over time has been corroborated from your experiences, made you an effective leader or decision maker, or both?
One was the example. He worked for two different ambassadors in Nepal. They were extraordinarily different, almost at the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of one was a political, one was a career person, one was a mountain climber, one was a bookworm. Their leadership styles were very, very different. Watching him adapt and help us adapt to the two was very important. He was very good at explaining this is the Foreign Service way. That maybe that's not how you did it in your schoolroom, but these are some things that work better than what you're doing. Very informative. The State Department performance evaluation includes an area for improvement, and he worked with me on those areas. But also, very important, introduced me to people that got me my next job, and that got me my next job. And so it was just that knowledge of how it works, and saying they needed a Nepal desk officer, all of a sudden he's like, here's Nancy.
Okay. So sort of networking in a way.
Networking, absolutely. That's the word I was looking for. And that's very important in the Foreign Service. The job that I actually got the consular job in Nepal as a result of a malpractice on the State Department's part. It was found as part of a class action suit that those women who were identified as political and economic officers were assigned a second consular tour. So the normal one is 1 to 2 years. Then we were getting an additional 2 years before we were allowed to go off to be political or economic officers.
This wasn't happening with the male counterpart?
No. And it was in the hope that we would quit.
Interesting.
And I took the settlement. It was $5,000. I felt a little guilty about it because even at the time I recognized that tour as a consular officer had helped me so much. I met my mentor. I sat in on the senior staff meeting every week. I watched leadership. I watched how things worked or didn't work under the two ambassadors. I networked. I met a lot of people that were important to me in that position. But it was an example of what was happening at the State Department in terms of attitudes toward women.
So a particular practice that was inhibiting others.
Right.
yet you still benefited and you were able to recognize how you benefited despite the bad practice from a second consular tour.
Yeah, I think the women that succeeded, we all poured coffee, we all were the note takers. But if you were the note taker, then you wrote up the notes. You went into the boss. They could see how well you could, or not, how well you could write. You got a little more attention. Maybe the next time they had some kind of an extra project, it would go your way rather than to the person that didn't take the notes.
Interesting. So shifting somewhat, having had the benefits of a mentor, what did you do as a mentor?
My formal mentoring was my 2 DCM ships, and I'm very proud to say that several of the officers that I mentored are either former or current ambassadors, and I'm very proud of that. But we had monthly meetings. I also, in Pakistan, despite the fact that I was very busy, had a monthly meeting with all of the junior officers as the ambassador, not the mentor-in-chief as deputy chief of mission, to make sure that they were doing well and got some attention. I networked on their behalf. I helped introduce them to people that were going to be important in the next assignment. We spend a lot of time listening. Also trying to set a good example of what leadership looks like in the State Department. I think that's a critical role that people don't realize, that people are watching.
And for you, what would be the definition of good leadership?
Taking care of your people. This was Secretary Powell's big addition to our list of things that we do. Making sound decisions, having excellent reporting that accurately reflected what was happening in the country. Looking at, I was very big on setting goals. We worked together to have embassy goals, and then I would take them and have a quarterly set that was my goals. What was I going to do during the quarter to support that? Encouraging each of the sections of the embassy to do the same thing. It would get down into the micro level at their level that and also being aware that, for example, the trafficking report was due, so that was part of that quarter's requirements, and being aware of what was coming down the pike, of not getting sideswiped by things that you'd forgotten. I put a big emphasis on being organized and not being late.
With the advantage of hindsight, what would you think are mistakes people have made when they are in positions of responsibility?
Part of my role as DG was helping to look at ambassadors that were out of line in various ways. And it came down to 2 or 3 things. One of the biggest issue, and it was on ethics. The State Department the U.S. government in general has a very strong ethics code. And for some reason, particularly for people coming from the outside, our political ambassadors, they weren't used to that. So the idea, just as an example, the first week I was in India, I was invited to a wedding. I did not know the people. The invitation included a sari, a beautiful silk sari. I had it evaluated. It was worth $400. My gift limit was $25. There are lots of people who would have said, "Oh, that will look very nice on my wall or on my wife or whatever."
Yes.
We started sending them back, and it was a real kind of revelation to the Indians, for whom this is usual practice, that we would put a note in saying that U.S. government regulations required that I return this. But people had real problems with the ethics rules, and it was over, maybe over $50. It wasn't over $50,000. It was small stuff, but it set a bad example in the embassy. It encouraged other people to sort of move. The other one, and this is the really big one, when you're ambassador, it's one of the few places, I think, left, other than maybe being a king in a country where it matters that you're the king, not a constitutional monarch, where you have enormous authority and you have enormous support. You have a beautiful house for the most part. You have a car and driver. You have a secretary. You have all of this support system. And it leads to some people not being able to say, I'm still me. There's an arrogance, and that arrogance turns into abusive behavior. And this is a big problem, I think, particularly for the ambassadorial corps, of just not letting this go to your head, of remembering that, as one of the best pieces of advice I got was when I came back to the department after my first ambassadorship, and we had our senior staff meeting in the office I was in, and one of the gentlemen came up to me and he said, "Can I offer you a piece of advice?" And I said, "Sure, I need all the advice I can get at this point." He said, "When you go down to the parking garage tonight, don't forget to get in the front seat." And, people didn't have that sense of, he had apparently watched an ambassador get in the back seat of his own car, sit there for 30 seconds and realize there was no driver anymore, and have to get out and get in the front seat. But it was symbolic of knowing that this is a time-limited appointment, that you are going to go back to the real life at some point, the real world at some point. And but also of keeping in mind that the taking care of your people includes being considerate of them, of following the rules on equal opportunity issues, and but it remains an issue for some people of just how you adjust to this new status, and you've worked your entire career to get it, and an expectation that people are going to snap to it, and then it doesn't happen, and you lose your cool, and you got to get over that.
Well, I guess it goes to the cliche, the quote, power corrupts, right?
Yeah.
Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Speaking again to your position as an ambassador in India and to Pakistan, two countries that are at odds with one another over the years, and in light of the recent conflict in the Middle East, should this conflict escalate, what are the impacts based on your experiences having served ambassador to both those countries, if any, on India, on Pakistan?
Let me start with the impact on the embassies. I noticed on Sunday that, for example, the dependents of the embassy in Beirut, the family members, were removed from Lebanon. So what tends to happen, for example, in Pakistan, I was there during the Second Gulf War, the Iraq War. We had a plan in place to say, we're not sure what's going to happen in Pakistan. There could be a real bad reaction to our going in. We knew that, you could see the signs that it was coming. So we developed a plan that would allow us to evacuate with people knowing they were either going to stay or they were going to go, what they were going to do when they left. And so that planning aspect, it tones down the emotion of it. Sometimes there's an emergency and you have absolutely no alternative. When I was DCM in Togo, I was the chargé. There was a coup attempt against the president on American Thanksgiving Day. And the capital city of Lomé shares the international border with Ghana. So I called my colleague in Ghana and asked if he could arrange for me to send the family members out of the city and over to Ghana. And the answer was, it's Thanksgiving, talk to me tomorrow. That's not the answer you should get.
Yes.
So the planning right now, for example, I am quite sure that in both India and Pakistan, when I arrived in Pakistan in 2002, India and Pakistan were very close to war. There was some intelligence, some speculation that there might be an outbreak. They had soldiers up against the border, and it was 117 degrees outside. The role that the United States can play in this is the Deputy Secretary of State at that time, Richard Armitage, came out to both capitals, made a proposal which was accepted. They were able to disengage. That quite often is a role America can play to set up a reasonable option. They also can say, well, the Americans helped us with this. In this last one between India and Pakistan, The Indians are very sensitive about not having America tell them what to do. They will accept an American proposal, but they don't want to be told what to do. And they're also very, very sensitive about the idea that America will mediate. The Pakistanis would welcome that. The Indians reject it. That was not coming out of the American system. There was a push to be the mediators, and it went over very poorly in India. You have to know those kinds of things, that the embassy, the State Department people would have been aware of this, trying to get it up the chain to make sure that public statements reflect that. I'm sure that, I don't know the Middle East well enough, but I'm sure there's some things about Qatar's feelings and Iran's feelings and Israel's feelings that you have to take into mind when you're making a mediation effort. But America can still play that role. It's a very important role. Usually it's done much more behind the scenes. Mr. Armitage had private meetings in India and Pakistan. Social media has taken away some of that. A lot of it seems to be done now with a tweet, or whatever you call a tweet now. But that's still a role we can play. The UN sometimes can play that role if we encourage it. But it will have a major impact. I'm quite sure that the embassy in Israel, has all of their people trained how to get into the shelters. We don't have any people in Iran, so less concern about that. But as I said, they were sheltering in place yesterday in Bahrain. I assume in some of the other Gulf places they've been looking at whether they need to evacuate or not.
Do you see any concerns for Pakistan or India taking sides, or perhaps with both countries are nuclear, that they have nuclear weapons? Do you see a possibility of Israel looking at Pakistan as a potential threat because it is a Muslim country with nuclear weapons?
Pakistan has not ever been a real outspoken country on the Israel-Palestinian, Israel-Middle East. They will tend to support Saudi Arabia in particular, but it doesn't take a stand, and I don't see any reason for Israel to target Pakistan at this point. That the Indians have had a long relationship with Israel. They've used a lot of their dry agriculture technology. There's been an arms relationship. But they have their hands full trying to manage India, and I think they primarily stayed out of this.
Returning to easier topics, so to say, is there anything you took with you from your experience as a high school social studies teacher throughout your career as a Foreign Service officer?
I will say that when I arrived as a high school social studies teacher in the first morning of the beginning class of the State Department, I felt very inadequate and unprepared, and I now understand that even people with much more experience than I did had the same feeling, but I didn't know that at the time. In retrospect, and even as I was doing it, I found that there were certain skills that really did help. I had 5 preparations every single day. I had to be organized. I learned very quickly that you can't give written tests or written papers all on the same day because you never get them corrected. And that helped. The balancing things of sequencing things of that practice was very helpful. If you can command the attention of 35 8th graders at 8:15 in the morning to teach them American history, you can do almost anything. There's that presence. You don't have to be arrogant about it. You don't have to be draconian about it. But there is a presence that a teacher has to have in order to get the attention of the students and to make his points. I think those 2 things were extraordinarily helpful. Just the mentoring skills come pretty natural to a teacher, and I think that was very helpful. You learn with kids. And particularly as ambassadors, I grew up in a family that was always kidding with each other and making jokes, and that was a sign that they loved you. But if you do that as an ambassador, it doesn't work that way, and it doesn't work that way in the classroom. So that was an easy lesson to transfer. You learn to make jokes about yourself, and you can take things down by being self-deprecating, but you can't do it with somebody else.
Obviously, you can only prepare people so much. There comes a time where people have to learn through experience on the job, so to say. However, in my time as a diplomatic security special agent in the State Department, I'd see you posted in some of the different areas where we would train that you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of preparation, right? With that in mind, what are challenges unique to leading a diplomatic mission, and what can be better done to prepare folks who are going to lead those missions?
I think there's a couple things that are unique to the State Department situation, particularly if you're in the smaller countries and in the third world. If you're in Ottawa, there's all kinds of support systems. There's hospitals. But the thing you have to keep in mind is that I was once told the comparison is to being a small town mayor. You're dealing with the policies. You've got to keep the city running. At the same time, you've got these citizens that have to be taken care of. What's the situation at the school? If the school is not working well, you have a lot of unhappy people in your embassy. If the commissary shipments aren't coming in on time with American food, again, you have very unhappy people. If there's a sense that there's danger coming and you're not being honest about it, you're not being informative about it, again, you have a lot of unhappy people. And that gets reflected in the work. If people are unhappy at home, they bring some of that to the job. And so that community piece is very different. If you're here in Washington, you may know that your coworker has a sick child but maybe not. In the embassy, you know. And that community, having lived in a town of 900 people, there were certain benefits of that. You learned that if people didn't know something, they just made it up, and there's a certain amount of having to deal with that or just ignore it, and making that decision of when do you have to take it on, and when do you just say that's part of the job. But the community piece is very different than if you're an executive, and it's one of the pieces that our political ambassadors, we particularly, when I was helping with the training for ambassadors, it was one of the things we really emphasized is it's not just making the foreign policy. You've got this bigger group out there that you've got to think about. People making career decisions. The other thing about the State Department is that at best you have 1-year tours in very dangerous places. You have 2-year tours in places where there's hardship as a result of health or distance or whatever. And then 3-year tours in the first world. But there is a constant churn. As I said, in Pakistan, I didn't have the same senior staff 2 weeks in a row. In other places, every summer, maybe you lose a third of your embassy, a half of your embassy if it's a 2-year tour. So that churn is very different than, and the recruitment, the onboarding, of how do you get these people to meet their contacts, how do you get them to get up to speed, particularly if there's some kind of a danger, but or some kind of a major policy issue. You've got to be able to do that very quickly. How do you say farewell? I never got very good at saying farewell to people.
As you peer in the rearview mirror, anything you would have done differently?
Well, I think if you talk to the people that I worked with, they probably have all kinds of things. I think, not making the change into social media very successfully would be one of them. My last few months in India were very difficult ones. We had an incident involving an Indian diplomat here in the States that resulted in really some very tough times. And, as I look back, I would have done some things differently, but you have to do it at the time, and you also have to move on. I can't go back and change that. And, you do the best of helping your successors if they reach out, say, this is what for example, I met with the former now former ambassador to India, the last time I was visiting, and he was facing the possibility of, again, a downturn in relationships over the intelligence that we had that an Indian diplomat was targeting a Sikh dissident here in the States. Canada had one killed, and he was trying to learn from me what happened, how did you do it, what would you do different, and so you're available for those kinds of discussions, and that's one of the ways you can have your do-over maybe.
On a final note, I've always found if you really want to get to know people, you eat what they eat, you read what they read. So any recommendations you have for folks out there, a favorite dish that you experienced over your time, and a preferred book that may come to mind?
I think one of the joys of the Foreign Service is that no 2 days are the same. And I went from learning to eat South Asian food, and I'm very fond of tandoori chicken or tandoori lamb. All of the trimmings that go with it. I love the naan bread. I totally, completely amaze my South Asian friends by eating peanut butter on my naan for breakfast, but they can't quite believe that. But I would agree it's very important. When I went to Togo, here was a whole new menu. I had the experience of sitting down with, fairly early on in my tour in Uganda with President Museveni, and he offered me lunch, and I'm a picky eater, which is a problem in the Foreign Service. and I also should not play poker, so I looked at my food wondering, what in the world is this? And he looked at me and he said, "We don't eat brains here. This is from my cows."
Interesting.
And the fact that we could laugh about it, and I completely cleaned my plate, took care of it.
And it's funny you mentioned Uganda, because also sometimes you experience commonalities. I'm originally from New Orleans, and I remember in the cafeteria at the embassy there, having served in Uganda, they had two types of dishes, one styled more from an American diet, and then one representative of the Ugandan cuisine. And I would typically eat from the Ugandan side, and red beans and rice was a part of that, but that's
right.
Also part of a New Orleans diet. And I remember someone commenting to me, you're eating that? It's like, this is what we eat in New Orleans, so it's nothing different.
Yeah, Linda Thomas Greenfield has made a statement out of talking about gumbo diplomacy from Louisiana. But also I got so, particularly in India, this was a major problem, because you had people that the Hindus didn't eat beef, the Muslims didn't eat pork, the vegetarians didn't eat any of the above. And trying to have a menu, it was a major effort. But in terms of books, I've read an enormous number of books over the years. It's, again, one of the pleasures of the Foreign Service. And Nepal, we had no television, so between bridge and reading, I did an enormous amount. But I think Colin Powell's book, his autobiography, is one that influenced me. I learned a great deal from it, and his leadership style comes through and being a Powell, it was, we had our moments of confusion. I was known as the other Powell.
Well, in conclusion, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
Just to thank you, and I hope that the people that are listening benefit from thinking about leadership. And sometimes you're so busy doing it that you don't have time to think about it. And so these are, I think, helpful to people that are practicing it. And good luck.
I appreciate that. They appreciate that as well. And again, thank you for this opportunity. And maybe we can do this again in the future.
I look forward to it. Thank you.